shift in American family values is contributing to estrangement between parents and their children. Both parents and adult children often fail to recognize how profoundly the rules of family life have changed over the past century. Parents often struggle with profound feelings of grief and uncertainty. They may say, if I get sick during the pandemic, will my son break his 4 years of silence and contact me? Or will I just die alone? How am I supposed to live with this kind of pain if I never see my daughter again? My grandchildren and I were so close, and this estrangement has nothing to do with them. Do they think I abandoned them? In a book titled When Parents Hurt, psychologist and author Joshua Coleman talks about mothers and fathers who want help healing the distance with their adult children and how to cope with the pain of losing them. He also treats adult children who are estranged from their parents. Some of those adult children want no contact because their parents behave in ways that were clearly abusive or rejecting. To make matters worse for their children and themselves, some parents are unable to repair or empathize with the damage they caused or continue to inflict. However, his recent research and clinical work over the past 4 years has shown that you can be a conscientious parent and your kid may still want nothing to do with you when you get older. However they arrive at estrangement, parents and adult children seem to be looking at the past and present through very different eyes. Estranged parents often say that their adult child is rewriting the history of their childhood, accusing them of things they didn't do, and failing to acknowledge ways in which the parent demonstrated their love and commitment. Adult children frequently say the parent is gaslighting them by not acknowledging the harm they caused or are still causing, failing to respect their boundaries and being unwilling to accept the adult child's requirements for a healthy relationship. Both sides often fail to recognize how profoundly the rules of family life have changed over the past half-century. Never before have family relationships been seen as so interwoven with the search for personal growth, the pursuit of happiness, and the need to confront and overcome psychological obstacles, says historian Stephanie Kuntz, Director of Education and Research for the Council on Contemporary Families. For most of history, family relationships were based on mutual obligations rather than on mutual understanding. Parents or children might reproach the other for failing to honor or acknowledge their duty, but the idea that a relative could be faulted or failing to honor or acknowledge one's identity would have been incomprehensible. Historian Stephen Mintz, author of Huck's Raft, A History of American Childhood, made a similar observation by saying, families in the past fought over tangible resources like land, inheritances, and family property. They still do, but all this is aggravated and intensified by a mindset that seems to be distinctive to our time. Our conflicts are often psychological rather than material, and therefore even harder to resolve. In the book titled The Marriage Go-Round, Johns Hopkins University sociologist Andrew Cherlin wrote that starting in the late 19th century, traditional sources of identity such as class, religion, and community slowly began to be replaced with an emphasis on personal growth and happiness. By the second half of the 20th century, American families had gone through changes that Cherlin said were unlike anything that previous generations of Americans had ever seen. Deciding which people to keep in or out of one's life has become an important strategy to achieve that happiness. While there's nothing especially modern about family conflict or a desire to feel insulated from it, conceptualizing the estrangement of a family member as an expression of personal growth, as it is commonly done today, is almost certainly new. Of course, not all individuals base their ideas of family on these more individualized principles. Most immigrant families, especially those in the first generation, still value interdependence and family duty, Mintz noted. However, in recent decades, the majority of American families have experienced weakening ties and high rates of mobility and dispersion. I would argue that these factors have made the opportunities for alienation greater than in the past, says Mintz. Estrangement seems to affect a small but significant portion of families in the United States, and it is happening today against a backdrop of record high parental investment. During the past 50 years, people across the classes have been working harder than ever to be good parents. They have given up hobbies, sleep, and time with their friends in the hope of slingshotting their offspring into successful adulthood. On the positive side, this increased investment of time and affection has meant that parents and adult children are in more consistent and positive contact than in prior generations. Due to the likelihood of divorce, many parents in the past half-century have had reason to believe that the relationship with their child might be the one connection they can count on to be there in the future. Yet in the same way that unrealistic high expectations of fulfillment from marriage sometimes increase the risk of divorce, unrealistic high expectations of families as providers of happiness and meaning might increase the risk of estrangement. Studies on parental estrangement have grown rapidly in the past decade, perhaps reflecting the increasing number of families who are affected. Most estrangements between a parent and an adult child are initiated by the child, according to a 2015 survey of more than 800 people. A survey of mothers from 65 to 75 years old with at least 2 living adult children found that about 11% were estranged from a child and 62% reported less contact than once a month with at least one child. In these and other studies, common reasons given by the estranged adult children were emotional, physical, or sexual abuse in childhood by the parent, toxic behaviors such as disrespect or hurtfulness, feeling unsupported, and clashes in values. Parents are more likely to blame the estrangement on their divorce, their child's spouse, or what they perceive as their child's entitlement. While estrangement can occur for many reasons, divorce appears to heighten the risk of both fathers and mothers, especially fathers. Fathers are also at greater risk of being estranged from their kids if they were never married to their mother, and might have more distant relationships with their children if they remarry later in life. In a survey of more than 1,600 estranged parents, summarized in Josh Coleman's book, Rules of Estrangement, more than 70% of respondents were divorced from the estranged child's other biological parent. Why would divorce increase the risk? Divorce can create a radical realignment of long-held bonds of loyalty, gratitude, and obligation in a family. It can tempt one parent to poison the child against the other. It can cause children to re-examine their lives prior to divorce and shift their perspective, so they now support one parent and oppose the other. It can bring in new people, step-parents or step-siblings, to compete with the child for emotional or material resources. Divorce, as well as the separation of parents who never married, can alter the direction of a family so that over time, members can become further and further out of reach. And when they do, they might not feel compelled to return. But in other cases, estrangement is born from love. One of the downsides of the careful, conscientious, anxious parenting that has become common in the United States is that our children sometimes get too much of us. Not only our time and dedication, but our worry and concerns as well. Sometimes the steady current of our movement toward children creates a wave so powerful that it threatens to push them away, leaving them unable to find their footing until they're safely beyond the parent's reach. Sometimes they need to leave the parent to find themselves. And sometimes children feel too much responsibility for their parents' happiness. Estranged adult children request better boundaries from their parents as a condition of reconciliation. As Andrew Solomon wrote in Far From the Tree, there is no contradiction between loving someone and feeling burdened by that person. Indeed, love tends to magnify the burden. Many fathers and mothers feel betrayed by their children's lack of availability or responsivity, especially those who provided their children with a life they see as enviable compared to their own childhoods. As University of Virginia sociologist Joseph Davis states, parents expect a reciprocal bond of kinship in which their years of parenting will be repaid with later closeness. Professor Agnes Callard stated that this expectation of reciprocity is fraught because today the boundary of parenting is unclear. If receiving shelter, food, and clothing is enough, then most of us should be grateful to our parents, regardless of how our lives go. However, if parents are supposed to produce happy adults, then fairly or not, adult children might hold parents responsible for their unhappiness. Part of what confuses today's parents of adult children is how little power they have when their child decides to end the contact. From the adult child's perspective, there might be much to gain from an estrangement. The liberation from those perceived as hurtful or oppressive, the claiming of authority in a relationship, and the sense of control over which people to keep in one's life. For the mother or father, there is little benefit from when their child cuts off this contact. Parents instead describe profound feelings of loss, shame, and regret. While most of the research focuses on parents and adult children, estrangements among other family members might not be uncommon. University of Wisconsin communications professor Christina Sharp found that estrangements between parents and adult children often ripple out to create other types of family schisms. In a forthcoming study of sibling estrangement, the Edge Hill University lecturer Lucy Blake found that arguments over caregiving or aging parents were a common cause of these rifts, as was sibling abuse. She also found that estranged siblings often report having been treated worse by their parents than their other siblings. After being estranged from her own parents, journalist and researcher Becca Bland started Stand Alone, a charitable organization in the UK that provides education and support for people estranged from their families. She notes that before considering estrangement, it is vital to let the parent know more about what is creating the conflict. While an estrangement may be necessary, it's important that you give your parents time and opportunity to hear your perspective and what you want them to change. To those who are open to reconciliation, I would propose working with a family therapist or mediator to talk through sensitive or painful subjects with your parents. Because the adult child typically initiates the estrangement, parents are often the ones who must take the first steps towards reconciliation. When reconciliation happens, parents often attribute successful reconnection to efforts on their part to make amends, such as taking responsibility for past harms, showing empathy for the adult child's perspective and feelings, expressing willingness to change problematic behaviors, and accepting their child's request for better boundaries around privacy, amount of contact, and time spent with grandchildren. It's also crucial to avoid discussions about right and wrong, instead assuming that there is at least a kernel of truth in the child's perspective. Fathers often seem less willing to accept those conditions than mothers. Mothers' willingness to empathize or work to understand the child's perspective might result from the ways in which women are held to a higher standard of responsibility for maintaining family relationships than men are. Fathers are deeply wounded by estrangements too, but men's tendency to cover depression with anger, social withdrawal, and compartmentalization might make them look less affected than they actually are. They might also feel that pushing back on the child's requests is more in line with their ideals of masculinity and maintaining authority in the relationship. There are good and bad features of modern family life in which relations are often based more on ties of affection than on duty or obedience. In these times, the people who choose to be close to represent not only a preference, but a profound statement of our identities. We are free to surround ourselves with those who reflect our deepest values, parents included. We feel empowered to call on loved ones to be more sensitive to our needs, our emotions, and our aspirations. This freedom enables us to become untethered and protected from hurtful or abusive family members. Yet in less grave scenarios, our American love affair with the needs and rights of the individual conceals how much sorrow we create for those we leave behind. We may see cutting off family members as courage rather than avoidant or selfish. We can convince ourselves that it's better to be alone than to do the work it takes to resolve the conflict. Some problems may be unsolvable, but there are relationships that don't need to be lost forever. It is sometimes tempting to see family members as one more burden in an already demanding life. It can be hard to see their awkward attempts to care for us, the confusing nature of their struggles, and the history they carry as they are stumbling into the present. It can be difficult to apologize to those we've hurt and hard to forgive those who have hurt us, but sometimes the benefits outweigh the costs. Author Tara Westover said in her book titled Educated, "When my mother told me she had not been the mother she wanted to be, she then became that mother for the very first time." We are all flawed and we always will be. This should be at the forefront of our minds when deciding who to keep in our lives and who to keep out, and how to respond to those who no longer want us in their lives. Take care of yourself.